Very Susian way, let's say. The whole business of what is a university, what are the kind of teachers who are populating that university, and how the university has in some way operated in very non-universal terms. It's been more about practices of exclusion than strategies of inclusion. I thought on the punitive imagination part of it, I would sort of say that, all right, what kind of a role law plays in the entire, in the fact that you have allowed for entry for a body of people who other people believe don't belong. So I thought I would sort of talk about law on three kinds of dimensions. One, in the first instance, the reason why you have the Dalit students or students from disadvantaged backgrounds or students who people of privilege believe don't belong is that one level of entry point has come with the affirmative action program, has come with reservations, and as a result of which that entry is made. What happens subsequent to entry is what Susie is speaking about. And also I think somewhere we need to acknowledge is that because the entry has not happened through self-reflection of universities to believe that as universities, we can't call ourselves universities if we are segregated, separated, elitist places. If we do not really sort of reflect, or we're not a microcosm of the country and we don't really reflect or allow for or revel in the pluralism of the country, then there's wrong. There's something wrong with it. But be it as it may, because you have the whole reservation policy and there is a certain observance of the law which requires that people enter in. So your first entry is in some ways for some people seen as a compulsory coercive activity. And that coercion was done basically that if you're faced up with, it is I was making in relation to one of our students who sort of lost his hearing, and we were trying to, he was a hearing student who suddenly had a medical issue and lost his hearing. And we were faced up with the thing of, what do we do to help him participate in the class? And one of my things somewhere was that he needs to be physically present to force us to think as to what we should do. If we end up accommodating him the wrong way, and saying, okay, you can sit, we will give you the notes at the end of the day and the teacher will send you something, the other students will help you do whatever, then in effect we would have managed the situation for ourselves but not really helped him in his participation. And I think that is amongst, for me, the first question, that possibly the entry being an unreflected entry for universities. You've not really thought that, okay, now that we have got people of from various ranges, I'm taking the whole lot, whether it is people, whether it is Dalits, whether it is the Adivasis, whether it is people with disabilities, whether it is the other people coming in from more rural backgrounds, a sort of diversity that comes in, how do you address it? How do you sort of get value from it? What is it that you feel you have to learn? Not that this is not the kind of course which is not meant for everybody, but it is like, what are the sort of interactions that we need to be setting up for us to really make for a university? That for me is the first kind of, and because we don't do that, the entry seems like punishment to some people. It's like it is something that we have to suffer with, because that's how punishment is generally seen, as something you have to bear, it is and you have to sort of grit your teeth and somehow the other get through it. If that's how universities look at the diversity inside them, then necessarily the reflection that you speak about doesn't happen. The research that should be happening doesn't happen. What is it that we can gain from the fact that we have people from so many walks of life doesn't happen. And if then you have the kind of teachers that Susie speaks about, wherein excepting for the third kind who's at least agonizing, the first two, one is in disacknowledgement and the second is in hostility. So first, by being disacknowledged, by being disacknowledging, is invisibilizing that student, because you're saying, oh, I don't see caste. Obviously you don't see caste because it doesn't impact you. But in the process, you sort of render a whole range of people who are in your classroom like they are not there. You don't believe that they, and in that invisibilization, the so-called neutrality is to that extent hugely problematic. The second one is, of course, actively hostile. And because you're actively hostile and you're persistently hostile, and both the first and the second don't take challenge, don't take dissent, don't take questioning, and nobody can really find place for themselves or ask for frames to be changed without dissent, without protest, without questioning, without interrogation. If you can't do it in a university, where can you? I thought it's a primary role of universities to be asking such like questions, to be saying that, all right, what is it in our social structures which causes for some people to not belong? What do we do? How do we equip people to do that? And if 3 out of 3, I mean, if I'm taking Susie's classification because I kind of agree with it, and I say, if you take that classification, that means 2/3 is not concerned. 1/3 is worrying about, and 1/3 is most of the time battling with their own colleagues to get them to accept that yes, this is an issue and we should address it. So what is it that is an automatic consequence? Is you'd have protests, you'd have what would be considered as recalcitrance, you'd have what would be seen as failure, you'd have as seeing as, oh, we are doing everything, these guys don't turn up, we have these remedial classes and nobody comes to it. You may also have, of course, no remedial classes, but you'd have both kinds of things. But the thing is that the entire process is happening in a very, not to get people in, but to point people out. And if you are on the receiving end of that, and you're just being watched on a constant kind of basis, at which point of time you create what the university terms a disciplinary issue. And how does it then address it? What does it want to do there? Sometimes if the second kind of teacher, that is the so-called expert teacher, is the one who's kind of handling administration in a bigger sort of way, you'd find that the discrimination, the stigmatization, the kind of looking askance is very much of everyday practice. And if you are on the receiving end of that kind of an everyday practice, you would be like very, very inhuman if it doesn't affect you at some point of time. And because the rules again have not been made taking into account that diversity, the rules have been made for a particular kind of student. So for you to fall on the wrong side of those rules is not very difficult. But the moment you break those rules, then it becomes an aha moment for the administration to be saying, see, we told you you don't belong. You can't cope up with. This is the sort of things that you're doing there. And you push out the student. And I think the range of examples that we have seen is to whether it is the crackdown on the protest, whether it is ignoring the protest, whether it is criminalizing the protesters, whether it is kind of picking up a particular activity and using a category of the law and say, what you are saying to me, you are in some way besmirching my reputation. You are guilty of quote-unquote defamation. You know, and you push it out. It goes out. The moment you start to say this is a discipline issue, which is not being handled internally. If it is being handled internally and it's being handled internally without observing principles of due process and fairness, and you don't give a hearing, you don't give reasons, you don't listen to what a body of people is saying, you hang them before they have spoken, then you push them out to try to look for justice elsewhere. If you arrest and you break down protests and you kind of criminalize, then again you are pushing it out of the university space, but pushing it into the legal space. You're asking for judges and lawyers and those kinds of people then to set it right. The students would be asking for it to be set right in one kind of a way where they would say, we didn't really get a fair deal. We weren't heard. We hadn't done anything wrong. We weren't kind of labeled and charged and, you know, like, it was virtually like a certain kind of scapegoating which happened. But someone has to be willing to hear it on the other side. On the other hand, when you actually criminalize, and we all have recognized the fact that one of the reasons why criminalizing is used as a preferred mode of disciplining by people in positions of authority happens because and I think when Anand comes, I suppose we hear that dimension, that a large number of people in society outside start to believe, who are not critical enough about looking at the events from that critical lens, who start to believe something must be wrong. You know, it's like here is somebody, students don't go around doing this, that and the other. If they created a sort of a criminal environment, then how else do you expect them to be dealt with? You can't expect, if a student wants to be treated like a student should behave like a student. But did you treat the student like a student in the first place is a question which gets buried beneath these allegations and counter-allegations of, violence, arson, there was a whole, or insubordination, or anger, even like very, very ugly words being exchanged. The defamation thing is a part of that entire thing that you... So you then push it to the law. I think somewhere it is that you take it to the law, and law people or judges are not educationists. They are primarily people who are used to performing that disciplining kind of role. Most of them come from backgrounds where they've never really heard of student dissent. They haven't really heard about exchange of views between teachers and students in a space which is open to both, where you are on a level playing field, and it's only knowledge which is kind of trying, both sides are trying somewhere to garner that. And for that, it's extremely important that you must have, I would in fact even say that a certain level of disrespectful disagreement in the classroom, because if you do not have that disrespectful disagreement, you can't possibly break the frames within which you are constantly having discourses. And when you are speaking about a whole group of people who did not construct that system, who has been roped into a system which they did not construct, whose life experiences is not reflected by that system. And I think all of us as feminists know that when we engage with patriarchal norms, if we engage with them, we've lost it. The only way in which we can get another imagination is firstly to rubbish the entire patriarchal framing. So if I have to rubbish, I will necessarily be somewhere on the wrong side of the law or the wrong side of norms. So when you push out and you take it to legal systems or to judges and lawyers, the chances of us getting a Chandru to be on the bench and to understand the value of dissent is like just the percentage of the sort of judges of that kind you have. Most of them are people who are products of the system, hence reinforce the system, and hence cannot be the place where you can, quote unquote, get justice for the excluded. The chances of your being able to obtain it is, I'm not saying impossible because that would be wrong, you do get occasionally, and I think that's where, but for us to get the sort of judgments we want from law, I would somewhere think the kind of research that Susie is speaking about becomes extremely imperative, because that research and that evidence can at least help challenge an imagination and say that you've been thinking about this matter in a certain kind of a way. But if you went for affirmative action, and if you wanted an inclusive society, then you jolly well need to worry about why that inclusion is not happening. What's going wrong? And if people who are being constantly failing or are constantly being thrown out of or are having criminal cases launched against them, let's look at the pattern. If it's all coming from people, from students in a certain walk of life, then something evidently is very, very grossly wrong. And it's to be able to demonstrate that kind of systemic discrimination that you can then possibly hope for something different to happen from even a punitive kind of a effort. My third point somewhere, and I think I want to, is to say that, okay, if I am saying that I do not have huge kinds of hopes from the law. I mean, I know we are all supposed to be making these ceremonial statements of having faith in the judicial system, possibly as a person who's kind of a product of that judicial or of that legal system, or at least some kind of a marginal player in the legal system. I would somewhere say that unless and until we very dramatically change legal education and very dramatically change the manner in which we think about the law, I would not want to put my money on the law. But willy-nilly, because whenever breakdowns will happen, whenever the first kind of teacher and second kind of teacher will not get along with their student who could have the law being used as a disciplinary instrument and people being on the wrong side of the law, it's extremely important that we constantly keep feeding, at least at the ideation level and also at the practice level, another way of doing law, especially in the realm of education, especially in the relationship between students and teachers and what constitutes a university. And that's where I'm coming to my third point, and I feel we need to start looking about, or law people need to start creating that body of writing, that kind of articulation, that sort of argument which speaks about law as a restorative exercise and not as a disciplinary. Which is like to say that, okay, if both sides got it wrong, the person who went in thought that I'm coming in and it's all done, and the persons who were opening doors, but opening doors just of their buildings and not of their hearts, evidently we need to be somewhere starting to work out conversations and strategies and to say, if education is becoming an exercise of dehumanizing, if dehumanizing is happening within the, within educational institutions, in some way it's the last bastion that we are in fact having fallen. It's the last frontier. Because this is where from we expect change to happen. And if this is wherein reinforcement of the exclusion is happening, then there's something really wrong. So the third body of teacher, who's troubled, and the third body of citizen, in fact, who's troubled, and the third body of law people who are troubled, need to be sort of putting their resources together to sort of put out a different kind of imagination, which then speaks in terms of that if this is happening, we would be in a fool's paradise if we think the loss is only of the student who's getting excluded. It's the loss of all of us. And it's because it is everybody's loss, I think everybody needs to contribute to the process of restoration. And if these series of talks begin this conversation for us in Hyderabad, I would think it's a long-awaited and much-needed beginning. Thank you so much.